I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Robin Chung. Robin is dad to 12-year-old Clive with PWS. He's a London-based consultant cardiologist who also specialises in treating heart problems in cancer patients and clinical trials. He works with fellow trustees Anne, Flynn and Andrew in the research working group for PWSA. And I would also like to add, which is not what Robin says, what he doesn't know about research isn't worth knowing. Robin, thank you very much.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It really is lovely to see so many people face to face since the last 5 years when we had our last conference here. We have a mic problem. There we go. Okay. I'm going to give you a talk today, which is an overview of research on Prader-Willi syndrome. And I'm also going to talk about why some of the clinical trials that make big news don't happen or get stopped. Because I think we have to kind of understand what the realities of research are and why things take so long to come to us to fruition. So in my talk, I'll talk about where we are now in a historical perspective on trials in Prader-Willi syndrome. I'll talk about what trials may be on the horizon. I'll tell you why sometimes trials are stopped prematurely. And I'll talk a little bit about the sensation around the new weight loss drugs in the media. And I'll give you an overview of what we do at PWSA UK for research. Here are some of my disclosures. I'm an NHS consultant cardiologist, and I also specialize in cancer patients with heart problems, but I deal with adult patients, so I'm not very good with children except playing with my children. I also like doing clinical trials. I work with the research working group with PWSA UK, with Anne, Flynn and Andrew, and I'm also a PWS dad to Clive. I have received a consulting fee from Radius Pharma, and this was donated back to PWSA UK. And I have no other disclosures. So let's have a kind of a historical perspective on what's happened over the last 40 years, we've just gone through our 40th anniversary with PWSA in Prader-Willi syndrome research. So if you do a kind of a historical bar graph of what I call the Google for research. This is a website called PubMed. It's sort of the Google for research trials. And if you ask it to plot a bar graph, it will tell you over a period of time how many publications match your search criteria. And I said, let's just do a search. Prader-Willi syndrome randomized controlled trial. And if you go all the way back to 1980, you'll see that there was one trial for Prader-Willi syndrome. And then if you go all the way up here, after, say, 2015 going into 2020, 2022, you'll see that there is more activity. And this search isn't 100% accurate for how many trials are ongoing, because it counts the number of publications that talk about Prader-Willi syndrome and research, but it's a rough indicator. And I think the message is, 40 years ago, we had one trial. And now we have probably half a dozen trials that are either in the running or have completed. And again, this is just to show the activity closer to present day. So I think in this sense, historically, it was a rare disease. 40 years ago, we didn't know a lot about it, how to treat it. There's a lot more activity now, and there's a lot more general interest in the public health problem of obesity. And of course, Prader-Willi syndrome is the most common but rare form of genetic obesity. So the question then is, why do we do clinical trials? Or as some people ask me, why do you have to wait for a clinical trial? And Prader-Willi syndrome is by definition an orphan disease, so it's rare. It happens in less than 1 in 1,000. And it has no effective treatment. That's the definition of the orphan disease. Rare is less than 1 in 1,000. Orphan means there is no effective treatment. So we have growth hormone, which we know improves some aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome, but we don't have a primary treatment which tackles the hyperphagia or the uncontrolled appetite. Clinical trials are scientific studies designed to test a theory, and you want to test it in a defined population, in this case Prader-Willi syndrome, children or adults. And a good way to think about a trial structure is to say, well, who is it aimed at? What's the population that you're studying in a particular clinical study, a scientific study? And in almost all cases, in our case, it's Prader-Willi syndrome, adults or children. And sometimes we take some lessons from trials in obese patients. The next thing to look at is, what are you doing that might change the disease? So what's your intervention? What's your treatment? And this treatment might be a drug, it might be a behavioral therapy program, or it might be a device. The next thing is, what are you comparing it to? What's your standard treatment? Either a placebo or the current treatment that you're doing for that particular disease. And lastly, how do you define what's changed in your population? How do you define success in your trial? And that's your outcome measure. And usually there is one primary outcome measure, which is what you hold yourself against later on when the study completes. And then you might have other outcome measures that are interesting things to look at. So in Prader-Willi syndrome, you might say, what's the change in the hyperphagia appetite score? What's the change in the BMI, the body weight distribution? Or if you're really brave, what's the change in weight? Some of these things that we measure are harder to measure than others. And sometimes the secondary outcomes, I think, that you are interested in. Okay, well, my trial might look at what's the change in body mass index, but also what's the change in behavior and anxiety measures. And these secondary outcome measures don't necessarily tell you if the trial is successful, but they plant the seeds for your next trial, the next study. So they generate more ideas for the next set of trials. And the most important thing, and this is what regulators who approve medicines look at, is, did the trial do what it intended to do in terms of the outcome measure before you started the trial? So you have to stick to what you said you were going to look at by the end of the trial. And some trials run into problems when they go to the regulator, because the investigators or the drugs company will say, it didn't meet our originally intended success measure, but here are some other things that are interesting, and would you take that into account as a measure of success? And because it's not something you specified at the beginning, the regulatory authorities are much more hesitant to approve new drugs on that basis. So you have to stick to what you said you were going to hold yourself to declare success or not success in a trial. And what kind of interventions or treatments might there be for Prader-Willi syndrome? Well, actually in this room today, we have a research program for behavior management. And we mustn't forget that behavior management on a day-to-day, on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis doesn't need to go through drug regulation. It doesn't need a 5-year trial. It doesn't need $10 million, $1 billion in investment. It's a trial which, if you learn about it and approach the professionals who run the behavioral trials, you can access at home much more readily than you would a drug. Drugs, I mean, it's all nice to think about a drug, a silver bullet which manages the symptoms in Prader-Willi syndrome, and we're not there yet. And I think the consensus opinion among our families, our children with PWS, and with our investigators is there will probably need to be 1, 2, or 3 separate treatments that work together. There is probably no one magic bullet that we know of at this point in time. And there are possibly genetic techniques. There are researchers working on these techniques in a laboratory, on cells, on animal models, and at some point it might be that we'll have trials in people. Tony Holland has worked on device therapy, so stimulating the vagal nerve, which slows down the body's response as a possible treatment for anxiety or Prader-Willi syndrome symptoms. And there are trials for this kind of treatment in other conditions as well. So you can see that the treatments that might work for Prader-Willi syndrome might be behavioral, there might be a drug, in future there might be genetic techniques, or there might be a device, or possibly a combination of all of these things. Let's go back to 1980, 40 years ago. The first trial was to try and treat the uncontrolled appetite in Prader-Willi syndrome using a drug called naloxone. And this is a drug which has sadly become more prominent in the media because in the current epidemic of accidental drug overdose in America, it's the go-to drug to reverse the effects of heroin or morphine overdose. But there was thinking in 1980 that it might help reduce appetite. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful as we'd hoped, so that kind of went away. In the 1990s, we looked at weight loss drugs, which had become quite popular just for general weight loss. And the one that came to attention was called fenfluramine, a mild amphetamine or a stimulant drug to increase your metabolism and to make you lose weight. And again, there was something that it might be effective, but over time we saw that actually there wasn't a significant difference in weight loss between people who had it and people who didn't have the drug. And later on, we realized that there were some side effects that came up with fenfluramine. And the issue with fenfluramine is you are more prone to heart problems if you've been on it. And the reason is the way the chemicals work in fenfluramine, they can cause scarring inside the heart on the heart valve and cause either stiff or leaky heart valves. And in large studies, we realized that more people who had taken fenfluramine had come to their heart doctors to ask with problems with breathing or exercise, and they had to have surgery on their valves. So these are major complications that came up later on in the history of using fenfluramine as what was at the time an effective weight loss drug. In the late 80s, we started to use growth hormone, and although this doesn't change the uncontrolled appetite in Prader-Willi syndrome, it does help with body fat composition, strength, and muscle density. But it doesn't help the appetite in Prader-Willi syndrome. In the 2000s, we had several trials where we tried targeting the actual mechanism of hunger in Prader-Willi syndrome. And again, successive trials, although they were quite ambitious, didn't actually end up showing a positive outcome. And the one to talk about here is rimonabant, which was a weight loss drug, but actually ended up causing some side effects in Prader-Willi syndrome, including depression, anxiety, and paranoia. So because of the psychiatric side effects, the drug wasn't given approval in Prader-Willi syndrome, which is a shame because it did have some evidence to show that it did promote weight loss. And again, this tells us that although sometimes a treatment might meet what you think is what you intended it to show, so it might show weight loss, it might show reduced appetite, if the side effects outweigh the benefits, the drugs regulators will say, probably a non-starter. And again, you have to start back from scratch. In the mid-2010s, there was a lot of excitement about oxytocin, particularly from Stuart Einfeld in Australia and Jennifer Miller from the US. And these trials, in small studies, showed some behavioral outcomes that were good in Prader-Willi syndrome. So they increased trust, they reduced anxiety, but they didn't reduce hyperphagia significantly, and they didn't achieve weight loss in our Prader-Willi children. So again, a lot of hope, but not quite what we had hoped it would do. And if you look at this graph here, the top red lines show you the caregiver impression of the improvement in behavior with Prader-Willi syndrome. The green lines and the other lines here are composite measures of behavior in Prader-Willi syndrome. And if all the lines were on this side of the graph, it would mean that it was successful and that there was an improvement. If all the lines were here, it would mean that things got definitely worse. But they're all in the middle, meaning there was probably no overall net effect on Prader-Willi children and adults. So these trials were what you could call neutral. They didn't meet what they intended to show. And so in the end, oxytocin really didn't go further in terms of being approved for Prader-Willi syndrome. Now, there were some trials that showed better behavioral outcomes with oxytocin, but again, they didn't meet the primary endpoints for weight loss or statistically significant improvement in what the caregivers thought or the hyperphagia scores. About 5 years ago, we started to see a renaissance of new targeted drugs for Prader-Willi syndrome. Beloranib, AZP531, and carbetocin were kind of three of the front runners for targeted studies in Prader-Willi syndrome. Beloranib showed some promise in losing weight and reducing hyperphagia score, but there were more than expected side effects in terms of blood clots in Prader-Willi people on beloranib. And so the US drug regulator said it wasn't going to go forward to get marketing authorization. So that trial ended up essentially in failure, and the company folded. There was another drug called AZP531, which was invented by a French pharmaceutical company. And this drug was designed to target a balanced hormone which seems to control appetite versus hunger. And again, this trial didn't meet its success outcome, and the drug was pulled, and the company was bought up by another biotech company. Carbetocin is an interesting drug because it's a new formulation of oxytocin, but it's designed to be a lot more specific. And it was formulated and taken forward by a parent who's a Prader-Willi mum in the US, and she started a company to investigate this drug. Very ambitious. She worked very hard to get funding and to move the study forward, but the pandemic hit. And what happened with her study is it didn't meet, again, their pre-specified measure of success. And so ultimately, the US drug regulator said it was not going to be approved for Prader-Willi syndrome. And this is a case where the drug didn't meet the original specified endpoint for change in hyperphagia, but it did meet it in a small subset of patients. So in certain patients who had a higher score, they seemed to do better. But the drug regulator said, that's not what you said at the beginning of the trial. That's not what you said you're going to hold yourself to. You can't use a second endpoint and say that's a measure of success. So ultimately, they didn't get approval from the FDA, and the pipeline for carbetocin has now essentially stopped for Prader-Willi syndrome. 3 years ago, we had an approach by a company called Soleno, and some of the families in the UK were on this trial for a drug called diazoxide. This trial looked promising, and when you looked at its overall effect, it didn't meet its pre-specified outcome. So the drug was not successful in reducing hyperphagia significantly. The drug company approached the US regulator and said, but hang on a minute, we had problems with the pandemic. We looked at a small group of patients within the study who had very bad hyperphagia. And in people with Prader-Willi syndrome who had really bad hyperphagia, the drug seemed to make a big difference. So although it didn't work in the overall population that was studied, it worked in a small group who had more severe Prader-Willi syndrome symptoms. So in this subset of patients, it was a qualified success. But again, from the drug regulator point of view, because it wasn't the primary measure of success that you were going to hold yourself to at the beginning, they said, you can't use this secondary outcome. You didn't meet your first outcome, therefore they haven't been given approval. They've been asked to do a different kind of trial to see if they can prove effectiveness in Prader-Willi syndrome. So this trial coming to market is now delayed. But the company continues to try push it forward. More recently, there was some excitement in the news about cannabidiol, which is the chemical component found in some forms of cannabis without the psychoactive component. This trial actually had approval in the UK as well. And PWSA worked very hard to gain approval along with our investigators to get this drug trial ready to recruit patients in the UK. But what happened was after the company started the trial in the US and they recruited their very first patient, the company was taken over by another biotech company who had a fleet of venture capital investors who said, let's look at your drugs portfolio. Let's see what drugs work, which drugs might cost a lot of money to put forward, which drugs are delayed. And after doing this overall sort of slash and burn mechanism, they decided to stop the Prader-Willi trial. So this drug got as far as approval across international sites to start recruiting. They recruited their very first patient, but ultimately an external force came in, an external commercial force came in and stopped the trial. And this theme sort of continues in the last year or two after COVID. This was another drug called Tezomet, which again was a drug that might induce weight loss in Prader-Willi syndrome and reduce appetite. They came to approach Prader-Willi Syndrome Association in UK. We were very keen to help them get the trial started. But then again, the company did a kind of a reflective exercise and examined what products they had in their pipeline for drugs, and they decided to stop the Prader-Willi drug trial. So sadly, this trial didn't go forward, even though we were readying it in the UK. So then the obvious question is, why do these drug trials get cancelled? And if you take cancer drugs as an example, a cancer drug might cost £1 billion to develop. And a big drugs company might have possibly 5, 10 drugs in the pipeline that they're developing in any 5 or 10 year period. And it takes 5 to 10 years or longer to develop a drug from invention to patent to animal studies to safety studies to large trials to approval. That's a long time. And of course, that's a lot of risk for these companies because they invest a lot of money. In terms of smaller orphan diseases like Prader-Willi syndrome, the drugs probably cost a lot less, maybe 1/10 or 100th the cost of £1 billion cancer drug. But they still take a long time to come to market and get authorization. So it might be 3 years or 5 years. So the drugs cost money, and the drugs take time to come to market with approval. And then more lately, the trend is for venture capitalists or hedge funds, financial money lenders, to invest their money in drugs companies. So there was a time when the thing to do if you were an investor was to put money into internet startups like Facebook or Twitter. But now, these investors are putting money into biotech or pharma. So they're looking for new drugs, new blockbuster drugs for rare conditions or important breakthroughs in pre-existing conditions. And so, like Dragon's Den, they have a short attention span, and they say, okay, you have 6 months, a year to prove the next stage of your drug development. If your drug doesn't meet that success milestone, it gets axed. So not only do you have the problem where drugs are expensive and take a long time to develop, but you get investors now who have a kind of a short-term view. If you can't prove success or progression every 6 months, every year, your drug may get stopped in its tracks. And I think this is what we're seeing with some of the Prader-Willi drugs, is they're being invented by small pharma companies, and then they get taken over by a big pharma company, or they get investment from a new set of investors who say, hang on a minute, small population, expensive drug, probably won't make money, may not get approval, let's stop it before they incur a loss. So it becomes a financial proposition. And so I think this is why several of the drug trials that we've seen recently have stopped for various reasons. And the investors are now putting money into medicine. So you'll see here from this graphic from about a year ago that around $30 billion of financial investment has gone into startup, new innovative drugs companies. And they'll be investing in cell therapy, in gene therapy, in drug discovery, or precision medicine. And that's probably where Prader-Willi syndrome comes in. So there is renewed interest from different sources of money to invest into drug trials rather than into high tech. But again, this is prone to its pitfalls, where the investors get nervous, they have short-term outlooks, and if you don't meet your success milestones, they will stop the trial and your drug development stops. We have to remember that there are also non-drug trials that are important. So we have groups from Birmingham and elsewhere in the UK who have been studying behavioral treatment techniques for Prader-Willi syndrome. Leo Bull has worked from Birmingham about signaling change in our Prader-Willi children, and it seems that if you signal change, then you reduce the intensity of outbursts or resistance to change. And these trials are important because they don't require drugs, they don't require regulatory approval, they tend to be low cost, and you can implement them fairly quickly, directly, in your own environment rather than waiting for widespread drugs approval and years of waiting. Now, the real question is, what about all these other weight loss drugs? There's been a lot of press lately in Hollywood, in the mainstream news media, that there are magical weight loss drugs under various names. So they have funny names like Wegovy or Ozempic. These are the brand names for the same drug, semaglutide. And there were some blockbuster trials in good journals in the last 2 years. So semaglutide is originally a diabetes drug, which tends to also reduce appetite. And in a large trial involving about 1,800 people who were overweight and obese, over a year, the drug showed that people lost around 15% or more of their body weight. That's astounding. So the top line says if you do diet and exercise over a year in a controlled study, you lose about 2.5% of your body weight, 3% sustained weight loss. With this drug called semaglutide, people lost 15% of their body weight. And these were people who weighed around 100 to 120 kilos. So if you weighed 120 kilos, at the end of the trial, you weighed about 105 kilos. If you weighed 100 kilos, you weighed about 85 kilos. And you kept it off for a year. And the longer-term studies say you keep this weight off for 2 years, which is the duration of the license for the drug. So this is actually profound. And this is going to be the big weight loss blockbuster drug around the world for people who have diabetes, and more the indication for people who don't have diabetes, who are overweight or obese. There is a second class of drugs, which is like a booster drug for semaglutide, which has 2 mechanisms of action called tirzepatide. And this drug had even more profound weight loss effects, 20% weight loss in people weighing 100 kilos or more who were obese. So really compelling studies in non-Prader-Willi populations, originally diabetics, but now non-diabetics. So the obvious question is, would it work in Prader-Willi syndrome? The problem is, with every good intention, there are some known and sometimes unknown side effects. And these drugs have some important side effects, quite common in about a quarter of people, feeling nausea, bloating, diarrhea, or constipation and headache. There are some rare side effects, gallbladder problems, pancreatitis, and about 1 in 1,000 or less incidents of possible thyroid cancer in animal models and possibly in people. We're not sure yet. The long-term data hasn't come back in. So, although they show profound weight loss here, as you can see, you're losing 15 to 20 kilos, if you're a 100-kilo person, is a lot of weight loss, and you keep it off over a year. But there are some real side effects here that we need to watch out for. And probably the most important side effect in this class of drugs is that it slows down transit in your gut. And that becomes a potential issue in Prader-Willi syndrome, and I'll go into that in the next slide. There is a drug called liraglutide, called Saxenda, which is also available for weight loss in the general population now via your local chemist. And this trial has had a study in Prader-Willi syndrome. So the thing to mention is the other new drugs, Wegovy and Ozempic, do not have Prader-Willi data. We don't have a Prader-Willi trial yet. But liraglutide does have Prader-Willi data, which just came out about 3 months ago. And in a study of around 55 Prader-Willi children and adolescents, they didn't meet their final endpoint. So the idea was to see whether you would lose weight and keep it off. And if you had lost weight, these lines would have separated, and they didn't. So in terms of meeting its primary endpoint of around 5% weight loss, it didn't meet what it was intended to do. So again, this feels quite disappointing. But I think the way to go forward with this is there is clearly a huge weight loss effect in semaglutide. It's going to be a blockbuster drug in a large population. It may be that although liraglutide wasn't able to show the 5% weight loss that it intended to do, it did show that it wasn't unsafe in Prader-Willi people. And that's actually probably not a bad place to start. And liraglutide is made by the same drug company that makes semaglutide. And the question is, can we convince them to do a trial in Prader-Willi syndrome? Even though liraglutide wasn't successful, it seems to be safe. So if that's good enough to edge on a trial with another drug, the other drug, semaglutide, that may be where we need to go forward. But for right now, liraglutide was not successful in Prader-Willi syndrome. So that feels like a disappointment. But I think there may be a silver lining in that cloud. So kind of lastly, what are we doing at PWSA Research Working Group? Well, we fund basic science in Prader-Willi syndrome. So we have a current project at the University of London. We have some basic scientists who are looking at models of genetics and cells in Prader-Willi syndrome. We are about to start a long-term project defining aging in Prader-Willi syndrome. We do some behind-the-scenes work. We work with trial sponsors who come to us. We reach out to investigators around the world. We also approach drugs companies to say, if you want to do research, the UK is a pretty good place to do research. We have a common research framework, we have a very keen group of Prader-Willi families, and we're really friendly. We write regular updates to our community via the newsletter and the website. We also aim to be a PWS information resource to policymakers and at government level, and Susan leads on this. And also, Evelyn and Anne will tell you later on about care models in Prader-Willi syndrome, and we are at the moment in the process of submitting a joint paper to a international journal to publish our best recommendations on Prader-Willi syndrome care. And this is something we don't do alone. It's a team. It's Anne, Libsy, it's Flynn Castles, it's Andrew and myself. So in summary, compared to 40 years ago, we have come a long way. We've gone from one trial for a drug in Prader-Willi syndrome to probably half a dozen trials in the making at the moment. So things have got better. There is continued interest. But drugs take a long time to develop. There are pitfalls that happen. They cost a lot of money. And sometimes external forces stop you. It could be the regulator. It could be your funding source. Or it could be COVID. But what we learned from COVID is if the world scientific community, along with participants, families, put their mind to it, what can you do in a year's time? And the COVID vaccines showed that you can do an awful lot in a year's time, something that might have taken 5 or 10 years previously when you put all of humanity's efforts into a problem like this. So that actually is a great lesson for us. PWSA, we are a team. We work with a great team based in Derby and also remotely. And again, I told you we have a small research working group. And in the end, everything we do for our children. And that's what motivates us. Thank you.